Hey everyone, and welcome to my multimedia presentation that primarily focuses on the evaluation of public history, which was covered in the first module of this course. This presentation will act as both an introduction into public history and as an example of different types of public history institutions. I will also discuss different real public history sites that fall into each of these categories. The sheer number of opportunities that are available to public historians is astounding. I know that I personally was quite surprised after looking deeper into this for myself. But what makes public history so different than the traditional study of history? And what makes public history so important when it comes to the overall preservation of information from the past? Really, when looking into either of these two research questions, we could come to multiple conclusions. But the biggest difference between traditional history and public history is the audience you're presenting your findings to, and the manner in which you're presenting your findings. These two important factors will help to guide this presentation and will hopefully help to increase your own understanding of this interesting topic. For a lot of people, sitting down in a classroom to study history just doesn't do it for them. Many individuals who could possibly have an interest in learning about history might be turned off to the idea of doing so if it means they're just going to be stuck in situations like I just described. How are we supposed to educate the public? Uh, though, if this means of learning about history doesn't always work. This is where public history steps in. Public history is more than just educating individuals about history. It's bringing history to life in a way that the traditional study of history doesn't do for everyone. On top of this, public history has a plethora of different styles of teaching that can reach a large number of people within our society and on our planet in general. Public history can simply come down to historical learning that happens outside the classroom. According to Introduction to Public History Interpreting the Past, Engaging Audiences by Leon, Nix, and Shroom, you can find public history at a museum, in a historic house, on a walking tour of a historic district, or on YouTube. Public historians can produce documentaries, historical markers, and smartphone apps. The field is broad enough to include more uh, ephemeral venues as well. A community event, a theatrical performance, a folk art demonstration. There are more forms of public history than we can name here, and new ones appear all the time, which is one of the things that makes the field vibrant and exciting. On top of the forms of public history described here, we can also see public history happening in libraries, archives, museums, which were mentioned, but also living history museums. Other less traditional sites could also be considered to fall into the category of public history, such as national and state parks, national and state landmarks, national and state forests, and national and state waterfronts. Obviously, some of these sites are more environmentally based. However, most national parks, for example, house many historic sites and artifacts. Cuyahoga Valley National Park, which I recently traveled to myself, is a park that is mostly environmentally based, for example. However, it also houses a number of different historic buildings and locks that were once part of the Ohio and Erie canals. The Cuyahoga River also runs through the park, which surprisingly caught fire multiple times throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. Throughout the park, there is information on these events that helps bring the past to life. National parks and landmarks are great examples of public history, even if many of these landmarks are less well known than the national and state parks. One national landmark that I personally think has made huge strides in historic preservation and public history is the Pullman Monument on the south side of Chicago. It's the former production site of Pullman train cars. I personally lived near the historic site in the past, and I could see the ways in which it had a positive effect on the surrounding community. The monument in general is a public history site that anyone can benefit from visiting. So, what are the most important things to understand when trying to evaluate public history, though? Other than understanding the types of public history sites there are, we also need to further discuss the differences between traditional historic study and public history. The main factors to examine here are audience, as stated before, as well as collaboration and reflective practice. But what do these terms mean? When practicing traditional historical research, your audience is generally made up of other historians, or at least other scholars. These are individuals who uh, understand how to interpret and dissect this type of historical research. When it comes to public history, your audience could be almost anyone else. This is why it's incredibly important to understand that all humans learn within the contexts of their own experiences. This is something that Leon Nix and Shroom heavily emphasized in their book. This is why contextualized learning is so important. Every single person learns differently and interprets information differently. The same two people will not get the exact same information from the exact same historic information or historic site. They will relate their experiences to the information they're attempting to absorb. Creating public history institutions that foster inclusive environments are crucial to preserving history in general. Next, it's important to discuss why understanding collaboration is important when discussing public history. Collaboration does happen with traditional historic research, but it happens differently with public history. Public historians have to learn to collaborate not only with scholars, but also the public and stakeholders. Understanding the public audience can better help historians connect with them, and understanding the stakeholders within the public history institutions can help you to essentially please all involved parties, which also while also accomplishing the mission of spreading historical knowledge and understanding. This is also where having a good reflective practice comes into play. Reflective practice is where public historians intentionally learn from both their successes and failures and incorporate this new information into the projects they oversee or will oversee in the future. While reflecting, historians should focus on meeting their ethical responsibilities and being fair within their interpretations of both primary and secondary resources. More well known forms of public history institutions are museums, but even museums can fall into different categories. When focusing on studying and evaluating public history, many museums generally fall into one of two categories: traditional museums and living history museums. Obviously, there are museums that don't necessarily focus on history, but for this presentation, we're specifically focusing on museums that are historically based. When attempting to describe the difference between traditional history museums and a living history museum, I will mainly focus on two real life examples: Pilgrim Hall Museum and Plymouth Patuxent Museum. Both of these museums focus on the history of the Pilgrims and the colonization of southern New England, and both of these museums are located in Plymouth, Massachusetts. Pilgrim Hall is a great example of a traditional, historically based museum. The museum presents their findings in a way, in more of a traditional manner, where exhibits are displayed for the public uh, in a way that allows them to act as their own guides. In general, the way this museum is set up, isn't much different from other traditionally historical or historically based museums. Plymouth Patuxent Museums, on the other hand, is a totally different type of institution. Uh, it is true that this museum does have more of a traditional museum within it, but most of the museum's grounds are set up as a living history museum. What makes the museum a living history museum is not only a 17th century recreation, a life-size recreation of Plymouth Colony, but also a Wampanoag village that guests can work their way through. The recreation of Plymouth has employees who are in period dress and who are also in character. They recreate that 17th century Plymouth feel for visitors. Um, each of these actors also represents a real person who was present at Plymouth. Within the Wampanoag village, employees aren't dressed in their cultural attire, but they are all of native descent, uh, which allows them to share their heritage and their culture with guests of the museum. While the aim of public history institutions should be to make history come to life, living history museums take this to the next level. Living history museums let you experience places and time periods in a totally unique way. They really take you closer to history than almost any other form of public history institution. Reenactments could also fall into this category of living history. Uh, Really, when it comes to the evaluation of public history, there's a lot to consider. We have to think about types of institutions and also the subgroups that these places fall into. We also have to understand the ways in which each of these institutions connects with their audience, or in other words, we have to understand how each of these institutions gets the public to trust them enough to accept the information that they're presenting. Uh, this is why it's so important, as stated before, to understand that humans learn within the context of their own experiences. Historians, and especially public historians, need to understand how to best gain the trust of their audience. Within Without an audience, public historians wouldn't even have a chance to showcase their work or findings. So, understanding the importance of one's audience is absolutely crucial. Thank you for taking the time to view my multimedia presentation this week. I'm really looking forward to digging into everyone else's work and seeing how learning about public history has influenced you all.